Hey there guys, gals, and non-binary pals, it's DMG and welcome back to Blitz. Today I have an intermediate topic for you in the form of your stats page and you. The stats page is widely used to discern how good a player is, what their, relevance to the game, or how efficient they're going to be in a match. While you can't see a stats page in-game while you're playing, I do think looking at this as a barometer and a source of reflection in how you can improve your numbers and get better is a good way to improve yourself. I mean, especially because you can pinpoint areas in which you are weak. And this is so nice compared to, let's say, other games which don't have this in-depth statistic for you to be able to go off of. Now, we're going to be looking at my stats page right now as an example. Of course, don't burn your eyes. It is a little bit dark purple. Don't mean to brag. Well, maybe I do. But anyways, let's get into it. So, the main thing about stats, a lot of people say, what's the most important statistic? Is it win rate? Is it damage? Do I look at average tier? Do I look at, how much you're in platoon when you're winning, and blah, 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 blah. I'll tell you right now that the most important thing is everything. Now, instead of looking at one singular statistic by itself, I prefer a holistic approach, and what that means is to look at the big picture. Now, one single statistic by itself can be easily manipulated. Any single statistic can. Like, take for example win rate. You could have high win rate but have an average tier of 3. You could have high average tier. You could have an average tier of 9.99 but then only have a win rate of 40%. You could have a high average damage but have a low win rate, which means you're just farming, right? So one statistic by itself isn't the be-all, end-all. So looking at a holistic approach is the best way to go about judging a player's ability, judging your own ability, being able to see where you need to improve. Now, I'm just going to go top to bottom through the stats page, and I hope you find this helpful. So let's look at these medals, right? I wouldn't say any of these are too good of a indicator for skill. It just kind of shows your most epic moments in game. So, I mean, Pools medals, Rosenial Heroes medals, Radley Walters, Kolobanovs, right? I think all of these medals are nice to have, but also keep in mind that part of being a good player is not putting yourself in Kolobanov situations. I find that most of my Kolobanovs came from when I was more of a developing uni rather than a uni that can just get a team and just steamroll somebody else. But granted, that's not to say that I haven't had Kolobanov recently, but it happens less and less as you get to be a better player because you're never really in those 1v3 situations unless your team just really decides to crumble. And I guess, hey, that happens more often than it should, right? But I guess for things like the Rosenial Heroes, Pools, and Radley Walters, I mean, that's not really the best barometer of skill. There really is no medal here that is a indicator of real true skill. Now, something that I do like to do just for myself, and I do think it provides, this is probably the most important one out of them all, is the Mastery Badges. Now, Mastery Badges show you that you have played in the top 1% of players in that tank at least once. So this percentage here of 67 out of 67 here shows exactly what tanks you have mastered in terms of percentage. So I have mastered all of my tanks that I have played in the public meta thus far. Anyway, I do think that it is important to look at the masteries in that you want to be able to say that you can play it adequately enough once, right? Because that shows that you have some semblance of what is going on in the tank. Or maybe you just got really lucky. I know that for some of mine, I got really lucky. I'm looking at the Object 268 when I say that. Anyways, but it is important to be able to look at everything from a holistic perspective. Now, I'm going to go through all of these period stats here. I don't think, like I said, I'm going to keep hammering this home. I don't think any one of these statistics is single-handedly the most important statistic to look at. Now, win rate, right? I would say if you had to pick one, right? But then again, it's still not the best, right? If you had to pick one statistic to look at, it's win rate. At the end of the day, this is a game of wins and losses, not 3,000 average damages or not, right? So, regardless of how much damage you do, are you being able to take down the win? And win rate is probably the most apparent thing to players when they look at profiles because it's color-coded. So having a high win rate shows that you have the ability to take down wins. You know, you help contribute to a positive result, and eventually, you know, you reach win rates where it's not your team. Like, you can't say you're lucky with a 75% win rate, right? After what? You know, what do I have? 22,499 battles. There's no way. You know, I can't be lucky for 22,499 battles, or in this case, roughly 70% of that number. That's just ridiculous. So for those rigged matchmaking theorists out there, conspiracy theorists, keep wearing that tinfoil hat because you will never receive any of my love. Anyway, win rate, important, but like I said, can be manipulated. Let's say you play only tier 2, right? Or only play the Kenny Otsu. Of course your win rate's going to be high. You're clubbing people who just got the game. Like, guys, you can get a tier 3 tank within your first 2 hours of playing. And people who play their Kenny Otsus or their T46s for, well, I don't know what, 20,000 battles, right? I've seen it before on certain profiles, but those people who just seal club like crazy and enjoy kicking puppies, it's not really a good indicator of, you know, win rate is not a good indicator of your ability, because then when you look at their high tier numbers, they're not impressive whatsoever. So, but in general, having a higher win rate is always better. In Platoon, this shows you how much of your victories you get are in Platoon. It does not show you your overall Platoon rate. It only shows your win rate when you're in Platoon. I hope that makes sense, right? So it's not all your battles, it's only the ones that you win that you're in Platoon. So, is platooning a surefire way to increase win rate? Well, I wouldn't say it's a causality, but I would definitely say that there is a correlation between platooning and win rate. Now, that Matchmaker does put platoons against platoons, you do have a higher chance of being matched against players who think the same as you, right? Because you say, oh, well, only good players platoon, right? Well, if that's true, and if only good players platoon, right, then you're only going up against other good players in platoon. So platooning may not always be the best way to go. I do think platooning is a bit of a crutch, though. However, you shouldn't get too hooked on platooning. Like, people who have over 50% in platoon, I don't think that that's necessarily a good judge of their individual ability. However, I do think there is a nice balance. You shouldn't have 0% platoon, right? You know, right? If you have any sense at all, right, and you want to get spare parts from your platoon missions, or you want to play with friends, because I mean, at least everyone, you know, should have a few buddies in this game that they want to play with, right? It should not be 0. You should platoon a little bit. Now, I personally think there's a balance, right? So I think somewhere in between a fourth of your wins and a third of your wins. So that is the percentages of 25 to 33% are acceptable for a healthy platoon rate, because that is still not the majority of your wins, but it helps you learn skills for playing with a partner. You know, things like focus fire and blocking shots for each other. Being able to communicate through voice should you choose to use a third-party app like Discord. I don't think that Platoon is always helpful, and being able to play for yourself, by yourself, is probably one of the most important skills as a uni. Now, Of course, platooning in terms of 30 days, which in the event, in the end does affect career, is somewhat dependent on the tank you are driving. Now, for tanks like the Conqueror, right, which are more team-dependent heavy tanks than others and need to be paired with strong heavy tanks like an E75, I do think that your platoon rate would be normally higher. But, you know, for tanks that I like to play, let's say your Leopard 1s, E50Ms, stuff like that, right? Most of my tanks that I drive are not platoon mate dependent. I don't like having platoon mate dependent tanks because, like I said, platooning for me is kind of a crutch. I use platooning sometimes to stabilize a win rate when my periodic win rate has been a little bit low, and then I just kind of level it out, and then I say, okay, I got my mental mojo or confidence back, so I can play on my own reliably. But like I said, most of my wins are from solo, which is by far the most important. Now, battles, this really isn't important. I mean, as long as you're playing, right, it doesn't matter how many battles you have. It just shows you what, you know, how many battles you've had over the past 30, 60, 90 days in career, right? Average tier, this is where things start getting interesting. Now, like I said, you can't just look at one statistic by itself and say, this is the only thing that matters. I wouldn't say average tier is the most important thing if you had to pick one, but you can't just have a high win rate and have a tier 3 average tier, right? You can't just have a high average tier and low average damage. So it really shows, you know, at what level are you producing these numbers? Of course, having a higher average tier is always better. You want to have the highest average tier possible, which in this case would be 9.99, as it is impossible to play a tier 10 average tier unless you get an account that only has an M60 or 121B or something like that. So it's impossible to have a average tier of 10. So get that out of your head right now if you think you're going to get an average tier of 10. 9.99 is the highest you could ever possibly have, and that will take, what, thousands, hundreds of thousands of battles to achieve. So I would say if you have an average tier in between 8 and 9 for career, you're doing all right. Personally, I think that playing at an average tier of 9 for 30 days for really good players is probably your sweet spot, as you're playing tier 10, and then you're balancing that out with tier 8 credit grinding to fund tier 10, and then you can also play tier 9, which allows you to play against tier 10s as well. So I think 9 is the happy number, or the happy sweet spot for average tier. But average tier is important as it allows you to put into context your win rate and your average damage. Now, average damage, right? When people refer to average damage, they usually aren't referring to the overall career or 30, 60, 90 average damage. But I wouldn't look at this career average damage too much. It's not uber important. I prefer to look at average damage on a tank-by-tank basis, but it is here if you are into looking at it. Anyways, WN8, this is a rough metric of efficiency, battle efficiency. I believe it is mostly based around damage, or how much damage you can put out in a game, or positive actions, discounting base capping, I believe. Anyways, the WN8, I would say, like I said, it's not the be-all, end-all, but it is a rough indicator of how good you are. I mean, it's not something that you should, you know, ignore. I mean, it's decent. I would say it's probably the best metric around now that Star 1 is gone. Just to have a first glance look and say, this is how effective you are. But like I said, you could still pad your WN8 by playing low tier tanks and stuff like that. So it's not the be all end all. So like I said, you have to keep it in context with all your other statistics. WN7, guys, don't worry about the statistic unless you're a purple freak like me who just likes seeing dark purple everywhere on the page. This pisses me off because this was dark purple a few days ago. But WN7 is a completely irrelevant statistic. Sock Robber Dave, if you're watching, this metric needs to be removed. It is not important at all. WN7 was an okay metric, but then WN8 got introduced, and then more importantly, supremacy mode got introduced into the game, and it made WN7 completely irrelevant with games happening where all 7 kills were not occurring on one side of the team. And granted, the amount of you could still cap out an encounter, but the chances of that happening were much, much less. So W17, not necessarily a good metric to use for judging ability. It's just there if you like looking at dark purple like I do. I've got to fix this. I got to move past it. I can't look at it anymore. It kind of annoys me. Anyways, damage ratio. This is, I would say, something that is pointed to on the forums that is pretty important to look at to judge player ability. So damage ratio in terms of how much health you have, I believe. Or no, how much damage you take in return. So if I have an 1000 HP tank, right, I want to be doing at least 1000 damage to the enemy to say that I've done my tank's worth in damage. Now, keep in mind, if you're like in a mouse or something, damage ratio is not something that you should be looking at, as you will most likely be taking more damage than you will be giving, but you are still playing a very important role in the battle. So like I said, damage ratio, it's something nice to look at, but it's not the be-all, end-all statistic, because sometimes, depending on your tank, damage ratio could be higher or lower. For tank stirs, it's probably going to be higher because you're going to be sitting at the back, not taking a lot of shots, but giving large doses of alpha. So, damage ratio, you should at least try to have a 1 damage ratio, right? It's when you approach super unit status, you're looking at about 1.5, 1.7, stuff like that. But at least try to do your tank's health worth in damage. That'll get you at least a 1 damage ratio. I mean, you don't want to have below 1 for this. Below 1 is bad. So that's damage ratio. Kills per death. This shows you how effectively you can remove guns from the game. I don't think that it's the most important thing, because doing damage is important, and anyone can shoot a tank. I know a lot of new players think that this game is like Call of Duty and the only thing that matters is kills, so they usually get kill happy. But removing guns from the game is important, as it allows you to use mobility and other factors of your tank to exploit the enemy team's weaknesses. It also is somewhat of a decent indicator for supremacy, as it is showing if you can take out guns in order to set the other team back on points. So there is some stuff going on there. Spots, important for light tanks, right? If you're playing tank destroyers a lot, spots is not your is not your thing, right? So important for light tanks and medium tanks, as they will be the ones spotting the most. Heavy tanks, maybe, but then again, keep in mind that you're pretty slow in a heavy tank usually, so you're not going to be able to get to the front lines quick enough to spot unless you're engaging other heavy tanks down an alley. So there is some gray area there. But spots, rough barometer, I mean, take it into account, but it's nothing that you should worry about too much as long as you're winning, right? Survival, important, because the longer you survive, the more opportunity you have to do damage and contribute to a positive win. So survival is there to show just how much you are staying alive to the end of the game to continue making positive contributions. But like I said, survival, not the be-all, end-all, right? If you're not surviving but you're winning 100% of the time, I mean, hey, keep doing what you're doing. I mean, I don't know how you're doing it, but if you're surviving 50% of the time and winning 100% of the time, you're doing it right. So, like I said, it's all in context, but generally a 100, not a 100, but a higher survival rating percentage is better. Damage per tier, I have no idea what this means, so don't worry about it. 30-day overview, this is just some of these stats taken into a 30-day overview and just posted here for the main thing. So it's for easier vision to see what you've been doing recently. This is good because I think that the trend now is to look at 30-day stats more than career stats. So it just shows you a barometer of what you've been doing recently. However, keep in mind that every 30, 60, 90-day stat does go into your career stat eventually. So I do like looking at career overall. I do think that arguably career is just as important as 30-day. W8 by tier, I don't look at these at all. These are useless. I do look at join the adventure. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, the player stats here, I don't really look at this chart too much. Of course, this blue line, it's always going to go up, right? As long as you're playing, this is your amount of battles. You can't go back in battle, so this blue line is always going up. This red line right here, this is taking a short snippet of a graph and allowing you to see your win rate. Now, this dotted red line right here that's a little bit faded is showing your periodic win rate. The most important thing here is that you always want to be playing at a periodic win rate above your current win rate. As long as you do that, your current win rate will increase. Now, since this is a snippet of a graph, although this win rate is increasing, it will look like a straight line here because it is a very small snippet of the graph and it looks like a straight line when you zoom in really close. That is some interesting things that I learned in calculus, and maybe you understand what I'm saying. But when you zoom in on a graph like this close, even the most sloped lines look straight, but your periodic win rate will still be zigzagging around all over the place. But like I said, even I trend low at 63 sometimes or 65, but you always want to have periodics higher, and even I've been trending at most recently 87%, which is pretty nice. So as long as you keep periodic higher than this red line here, you should be increasing your win rate regardless. Now, the things that I like to look at are here. This shows your tank win rate by tank specific stats, so damage per battle and win rate, and those are the two most important things I look at, for me at least. So I set damage targets. Like for me, I use 3,000 damage in tier 10. That's the generally accepted rule. Now the method is technically supposed to be 300 times the tier of tank you're playing. So if you're in a tier 1, 300 damage a game, tier 2, 600 damage a game, so on and so forth until you get to tier 10, which is 3,000. However, I don't think that is necessarily the best way to look at it, as let's say you're in a KV3 or an IS, expecting that you're going to do 2,100 damage a game in those tanks. That's a little ridiculous. So you have to adjust the target for the tier depending on what kinds of tanks exist in the tier to set a general tier target. I do have general tier targets for most tiers, but if you want to be extremely general, just do 300 times the tier. But like I said, that's not always the best way to look at it. Now you get to see the amount of times you've played in a tank. That's just the battles per tank. Something that I think is kind of funny is that people will always say that I just play overpowered tanks, but for me, I only play 100 battles in a tank if possible with an ace mastery. If I find that it hits my damage target and my target win rate, I won't play it anymore. So actually the tanks that I do the worst in are the tanks that I play the most, which are like the IS-6 low, which I have recently rehabbed 2 targets, right, so 2200, so I don't really play them anymore. But things like the E50M, which are still poor in terms of damage, and the Leopard, which is poor in terms of damage, I constantly play to try and raise them. Anyway, this is a great way to look at what you've been doing recently in a tank-specific format. Now, there's 60 and 90 days here, but 30-day, you can look at that too to see a tank-specific breakdown of what you've been doing, and also a latest breakdown to show what you have been doing in the most recent day. Now, the latest shows what you've been doing on a daily basis. If you have not played a tank in a long while, let's say I play like my Object 140, right? It'll take days, it'll take stats from my all-time stats and just kind of drag them in here. You need to play at least 5 battles in a tank for them to show up in your latest stats as a true representation of what is going on. It says that here. Oh, recent battle stats played in the last 2 days. My bad. Last 2 days, and it aims for at least minimum 5 battles. So play 5 battles if you want to see an accurate representation of what you've been doing. Something that I do like looking at on here is rankings. I do have a few #1 rankings here. Actually, only one now. T3485, I'm still undethroned, but T34-1 I did have, and I was recently dethroned. I do like trying to get these. It's just kind of a fun little thing, but mainly I use these to look at the latest stats just to see how I've been doing, specifically most recently within the day, to see if I'm improving my average damage compared to the career average damage in the tank. Why did I do that? But if damage is better and my win rate is better than my current win rate and damage for career, I consider it good, right? Same thing here, with the J Panther, right? So my win rate is far above what it is for career, but my damage is a little bit lower, so I'm probably going to need to play a little bit more J Panther. And when I do, and I take a few more targets out of the game, my win 7 will probably go up because, I am one of those dark purple stat freaks. Anyways, that is the stat page with Join the Adventure and Imperia Online included. Anyways, that's all I got for today. I hope you like the content for this intermediate topic. If you do, please hit that like button. And if you didn't, please leave your constructive criticism in the comment section. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to share my passion with you today, and I hope to see you next time.